Come back. Dear Esther, I have driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. Donnelley reported the legend of the hermit. There was once talk of a wind farm out here, away from the rage and the intolerance of the masses.
I have found the ship's manifest, crumpled and waterlogged under a stash of paint cans. A wonderful sight. The moon cresting the junction between the cliff path and the stone circle.
When someone had died or was dying, or was so ill they gave up what little hope they could sacrifice, they cut parallel lines into the cliff, exposing the white chalk beneath. We are not like Lot's wife, you and I. We feel no particular need to turn back. Dear Esther, I met Paul. I find myself increasingly unable to find that point where the hermit ends and Paul and I begin. He still maintains he wasn't drunk, but tired. Dear Esther, I have now driven the stretch of the M5 between Exeter and Bristol over 21 times. An imagined answer phone message. There must be a hole in the bottom of the boat. How else could new hermits have arrived? I had kidney stones and you visited me in the hospital. After the operation, when I was still half submerged in anesthetic, your outline and your speech both blurred. Is this what Paul saw through his windscreen? I've begun my ascent on the windless slope of the western side. The bothy was constructed originally in the early 1700s. When the oil lamps ran out, I didn't pick up a torch, but used the moonlight to read by. In a footnote, the editor comments that at this point, Donnelley was going insane as syphilis tore through his system like a drunk driver. They found Jakobson in early spring. The thaw had only just come. Climbing down to the caves, I slipped and fell and have injured my leg. I think the femur is broken. From here, this last time, I have understood there is no turning back. It was as if someone had taken the car and shaken it like a cocktail. I am traveling through my own body, following the line of infection from the shattered femur towards the heart. This cannot be the shaft they threw the goats into. It cannot be the landfill where the parts of your life that would not burn ended up. The moon over the Sanford Junction, headlights in your retinas. Of fire and soil, I chose fire.
Paul, by the roadside, by the exit for Damascus, all ticking and cooled, all feathers and remorse, all of these signals routed like traffic through the circuit diagrams of our guts, those badly ridden boats torn bottomless in the swells, washing us forever ashore.
From here, I can see my armada. I will drag my leg behind me. I will drag it like a crumpled hatchback, tires blown and sparking across the dimming lights of my vision. I've begun my voyage in a paper boat without a bottom. I will fly to the moon in it. If only Donnelley had experienced this, he would have realized he was his own shoreline, as am I. Returning to my car afterwards, hands still shaking, and a head split open by the impact. Goodbye to tearful aunts and traumatized uncles. Goodbye to the phenomenal. Goodbye to the tangible. Goodbye Wolverhampton. Goodbye Sanford. Goodbye Cromer. Goodbye Damascus. I have dredged these waters for the bones of the hermit, for the traces of Donnelley, for any sign of Jakobson's flock, for the empty bottle that would incriminate him. I am the Ariel. In my passing, I will send news to each and every star. Dear Esther, I have burnt my belongings, my books, this death certificate.
Hello everyone, I'm Dan Pinchbeck, I'm the creative director of the Chinese Room, and this is the Dear Esther developers commentary.
So you'll see around you in a lot of the environments, there's a lot of detail ingrained into everything.
Part of the point about the whole game, I think, was this idea that rather than having a linear, straight-through version of the story, that we could have multiple story units for each place you were, and I was really interested in this idea of how you can open up that space that people can interpret.
When I wrote the music for the mod of Dear Esther, there was absolutely no budget whatsoever for live players, so all the music was sampled.
Everything about Esther, for me, is a dream. This symbol on the beach, which is the golden ratio, it's one of the only things that's really left explicitly from the mod.
So something I wanted to do as an artist was create some kind of reward for the player when they explore the island.
So people have asked why the Dear Esther's set on a Hebridean island.
One of the things you're always trying to do as a composer is create memorable themes. And a slight confession is that probably the most memorable theme, which is Remember in Dear Esther, wasn't actually created for the game. Rob's looking shocked.
White lines.
Yeah. Something that I wanted to bring through in the art of the game was the same kind of fidelity that you find in both Jessica's music and Dan's writing.
There's a scene in Donnie Darko where Drew Barrymore's playing his English teacher, and she talks about Celador as being the most beautiful word in the English language, and about it's the sound of the words together. I think the central question to the entire experience, for most people that have played it or are talking about it, is this idea of, is the island real?
One of the things that's been most commented on with the audio and the music in Dear Esther is how sparse it is. And that was a really deliberate tactic.
So there's a lot of places in the game where you see a lot of strange things, and this is very deliberate.
When I was originally thinking about how to write the music for the game, I suddenly realised that you don't see anybody in the game, and the most important character as such is the island itself.
All right, let's talk about walking. Let's do it. We're gonna address the elephant in the room, the very, very slow-moving elephant in the room. So this might be a longer conversation because it kind of fits with that. The radio mast in Dear Esther was obviously there as a really important kind of design feature as well as its place within the story.
So something you'll notice as you look around the environment is, you know, from a distance you see the landscape. It's kind of a beautiful place in some ways.
We cast and did all the voice direction for Esther ourselves for the mod, and it was basically Jess and I on a casting website just listening to people's show reels and finding what's the voice of this thing. And there was never any question about Nigel. I think we heard his show reel for the first time around. It's probably been listened to sort of 30 or 40 actors. And we started listening to his show reel and just both looked at each other and went, that's it, that's him.
So this hole in the ground was kind of a difficult thing in some ways. It's a bit of a challenging aspect of the game. Because, in some ways, it kind of like, I think for me, we wanted to have this kind of this pit here, and I wanted the player to be able to actually go as close as possible and like look over the edge and you know, kind of have this feeling of dread and stuff. But the other issue that we faced was like, what happens if the player just jumps into the hole?
One of the really important jobs of a composer, I think, is to provide the player or the listener with different emotional tones and states.
Inside the bothy, there is a randomised chance that you can find an ultrasound picture on the table, and I think it's the one instance of randomisation in the game that is like the pinnacle of it, because the idea that Esther was pregnant when she died changes everything emotionally about how you understand the story. So as you leave the bothy and the seagull takes off, that's the one jump scare in the game, which is kind of interesting because when we made it, we kind of had to, you know, we kind of called it a ghost story, but there was no intention really. We kind of wanted this dreamy, hallucinatory type thing.
So one of the things that influenced the visuals quite a lot was the tech limitations at the time.
We should probably talk about some of the inspirations behind it. I'm on a strict you don't talk about Stalker kind of thing going on here. But when Rob and I started talking, I think one of the first things that we kind of discovered was how much we're both obsessed with Stalker.
Yeah. One of the more interesting and challenging things to do in the visual side of things is to kind of create an emotional connection with the player.
This is another of my favourite bits in the game, where you come along the edge of the sort of gully and you find hundreds of books, and it's one of the first times where most explicitly there's the suggestion that nothing you're seeing is real, because there's just no way that this can exist, and it's a really amazing, uncanny moment.
One of the really important images in the game is the radio mast. And the soundscapes that I wrote for the game are really tied into this idea.
The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point.
This, for me, is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves and games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look for it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod.
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really. In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we have this long corridor that's full of these kind of it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory and you know.
This is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound. And I don't think there's any other way around that. The motorway scene, the biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist in the mod at all. It was a completely new thing. So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break services just outside the junction of Sanford, but we also know players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. That's just the most amazing feeling.
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together.
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther.
It's probably the level which has changed most from the original mod, I think. It's much, much bigger than the final level in the mod.
I think one of the most fascinating things for me about planning this director's commentary has been that in previous years, when all the three of us have talked about Dear Esther, we've talked about the interpretation of the player. I'd been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints, and sometimes they're to markate where an accident has taken place. So you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers and candles.
One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again.
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the three games that we've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
Is Dear Esther a depressing game or a hopeful game?
For me, it's kind of like a mix of both, really.
So, Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about Walking Simulator? The last level ended up being quite a lot bigger than the original mod, and it's also the one where actually the movement around it is in a way the most artificial. There's the big zigzagging cliff paths that basically, it's like a series of straight lines from point to point. There isn't a lot of movement, and one of the things that was really difficult to do with that was to not make it feel too much like a corridor and to give it that sort of sense of space and that you were actually exploring somewhere quite natural. There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make.
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game.
The Overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb.
So here it kind of, the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again.
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here.
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced because it's two long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right and quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end and that this is it.
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other.